Colleagues, I also rise today to speak briefly to Bill C-235, and it is probably one of the more difficult speeches I've made in my time here in the Senate, not because of the subject matter, but because I am tasked with taking, at least in part, the opposite position that the sponsor of the bill has taken. And I do this, quite frankly, with a bit of a heavy heart. Jim Carr was a friend. He was a colleague. He's from Manitoba. I've known Jim for many years. And yet this bill was introduced by the late Honourable Jim Carr in February of this year, and just recently completed its journey through the other place. I know I have some difficulties with it, and I need to address those difficulties today. But before I go any further, colleagues, I do want to take this opportunity to offer my very sincerest condolences to Jim's wife, Colleen, and Jim's family and his loved ones. This is a difficult time for them, and I know that I speak on behalf of all senators when I say our hearts and prayers are with them during this time. I pray that they know the comfort of God's arms around them during their time of bereavement. Jim and I traveled back and forth from Winnipeg to Ottawa, not every week, especially in the last year or two when Jim's health was failing. He wasn't on every flight, but we traveled back and forth many times. There were many opportunities for us to visit on these flights, and I always cherish these times and will miss them. I was on a flight only 2 weeks ago with Jim coming from Winnipeg to Ottawa, and we had a good conversation. 4 weeks ago, Jim and I had lunch together in West Block. Jim invited me to lunch. And in our discussions, and one of the things Jim wanted, obviously, was to discuss Bill 235. But Jim did not ask me to support this legislation. He asked me to see if I could help move the bill forward to committee and to third reading. He did not ask me to vote for the bill. He did not ask me to not point out flaws in the bill as I see them. And I committed to doing that. And I plan on doing that today. I will always remember and treasure that meeting. We discussed many private and personal issues, including Jim's failing health. But we also discussed the vacation that him and his family were planning over the holidays. So yesterday was a shock. I was told not to talk about myself going to Mexico because that was the topic of some conversation a few years ago, but Jim was going to go to Mexico. And we shared our mutual love for the country. I did not, as I said, commit to supporting this bill. I committed to not standing in the way of it, and I intend to keep that promise to our colleague. I did ask Jim, I said in the Senate, many times the sponsor that you choose has a lot of influence. And I asked Jim, who is your sponsor of the bill in the Senate? And he told me it was Senator Carr. I told Jim he had chosen wisely, and I believe that. Last week, colleagues, just as a point of interest, and I think it at least in part addresses some of the questions that have been asked already. Last week, before we received the news of Jim's passing, the Senate leadership agreed to prioritize the consideration of this bill. It was appropriate to do so then and remains appropriate to do so today. I've known Jim Carr since well before his election to federal politics, when he was involved in provincial politics. And even though we were political adversaries, I consider him a friend. But I would not be doing my job if I did not point out what I think are the flaws in this or any other legislation. Jim did that all of his life, and he would have expected the same of each and every one of us. He would have expected us to give the bill a proper examination and to ensure that it receives the sober second thought characteristic of this chamber. As Senator Cotter outlined, the purpose of Bill C-235 is for the federal government to develop a framework for local cooperation and engagement in the implementation of federal programs across various sectors to build a green economy in the prairie provinces. This is a noble endeavor, but I would argue that it is both unnecessary and unwelcome. Efforts by provincial and municipal governments in the 3 prairie provinces to green their economies are already well underway. And the federal government, as is so often the case, is a little late to the party again on this one. This is not just an observation and a concern. It was reflected in the testimony given at the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. Cliff Cullen, the Manitoba Minister of Economic Development, Investment and Trade, testified before the committee and said the following: "The province of Manitoba does not support C-235 and views it as an unnecessary piece of legislation that lacked consultation with the provinces." Again, notice the word lacked consultation. "The bill has not been brought forward in a timely manner and does not recognize the progress that has been made within the green economy by the provinces, businesses, and entrepreneurs. The province of Manitoba is concerned that Bill C-235, if passed, would create unnecessary bureaucracy and a top-down approach that would delay moving forward the green economy, delay decisions on research and development, and stifle innovation that is already occurring." The Saskatchewan Minister of Justice and Attorney General, the Honourable Browen Iyer, I hope I pronounced that correctly, also testified, putting it this way: "This bill would require federal ministers to develop a framework for the implementation of federal programs, which to us in Saskatchewan sounds pretty top-down, pretty definitive language, and what we call here assertive federalism. It really goes to another deeper tendency on display from this government, which we see again and again, which is to veer into sections 92 and 92A and the exclusive jurisdiction that provinces have over property and civil rights and over natural resources." When asked if she thought the bill was unnecessary, the minister was clear. She said, "I don't think the bill is necessary. I think we are already doing significant things in Canada, in Western Canada, and in Saskatchewan around emissions. I've referenced some of them. The emissions from our potash sector are 50% lower than those in any other jurisdiction in the world. We have high environmental standards. We have high human rights standards. And we have high labor standards." These concerns were echoed by Ms. Kathy Heron, the President of Alberta Municipalities, when she said, "The language in this section speaks to the creation of a green economy in Canada's prairie provinces. This seems to suggest that prairie provinces do not currently have a green economy. We are very much already heading down this path." Excuse me. Other stakeholders were not only concerned that the bill failed to recognize the progress already being made to green the prairie economy, but noted that the bill may actually impede these efforts. Ms. Justine Ness, President and Chief Operating Officer of Safety First, a company which works closely with the energy sector, said, "I fear that Bill C-235, in its current form, will effectively harm the resource industry in Canada even further and rob the world of the energy security it so desperately needs." Bill C-235 seems to be a classic federal overreach, trying to dictate and influence these three Western provinces. Ms. Catherine Brownlee, president of Alberta Enterprise Group, said, "Alberta businesses are on the cutting edge of technological innovation, emissions reduction, and green innovation. Given that Alberta is already a leader in this field, it does cause us to wonder as business leaders what the positive impact would be of another Ottawa-based framework as proposed in this bill." Colleagues, this is a common complaint on the part of provinces. The federal government has a habit of repeatedly inserting itself into provincial affairs without consultation, and this bill is going to result in more of the same. When Saskatchewan MP Michael Cram asked MP Carr if he had consulted with the Premier of any provincial cabinet ministers in Saskatchewan, MP Carr admitted that no, he had not. MP Brian Massey pursued this line of questioning further, asking, "Other than Saskatchewan, is there any provincial support for it? Any premiers or provincial explicit support from ministers?" The answer, no. What about an endorsement from First Nations? No. Well, he asked, are there petitioners who have been calling for this kind of a framework? No. At committee, Ray Orb, the president of Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, was asked, "Did you have any consultations with the federal government before this bill was brought forward to the committee and the House of Commons?" His answer, "No, we didn't have any contact with Mr. Carr. He did not consult with us on this bill." Colleagues, apparently the plan is to pass the bill requiring a framework to be put in place, and then the consultations will happen later in the course of developing that framework. But I would note two things. First of all, the bill allows only 12 months for a framework to be put in place. That is far from sufficient time for proper consultations, especially when you consider that those consultations must include, and I quote, "provincial government representatives responsible for transportation, environment and employment, and with municipalities, Indigenous governing bodies, the private sector, and representatives of employers and employees in that sector." In addition, the minister responsible for economic development in the Prairie provinces must collaborate with 6 other ministers, including the Minister of Environment, the Minister of Transport, the Minister of Industry, the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, the Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Natural Resources. This is no small task. There is no way that 12 months will allow sufficient time for those consultations. But secondly, colleagues, promising to consult on the content of a framework when there is no agreement that the framework should even exist in the first place is putting the cart before the horse. It is not the way to develop sweeping public policy initiatives which this framework would yield if it is successful. Colleagues, it is the Senate's role to stand up for the rights of regions. And I can tell you unequivocally that the regions which will be directly affected by this bill do not want and do not support this bill. The intent behind this bill is noble, but it is redundant because the provinces are already making great strides toward the greening of their economies. And it is overreaching because it does not have the concurrence of every province that will be impacted by it. However, as I said earlier, although I have pointed out the many difficulties in this bill, I will not oppose it proceeding to committee. As a matter of fact, I will support it proceeding to committee because that is where the Senate does its very best work. Do I wish we had more time? Without question. It is the duty and role of both the committee and this chamber to consider the bill on its merits. So I support it going to second reading and look forward personally to participating at committee on this bill. I hope you support the same. Thank you, colleagues.
Senator Pat